Before we begin, viewer discretion is advised. This content is intended for entertainment. What happens when one of America's most skilled legal minds and respected journalists, someone who has spent decades mastering debate, analyzing arguments, and cutting through political spin, appears on a late-night show hosted by someone convinced their perspective represents enlightened reason while the opposition is an existential threat? When a woman, respected across the political spectrum for refusing to be captured by either tribe, faces a host who treats progressive orthodoxy as self-evident truth, when 5 minutes of calm, fact-based reasoning systematically dismantle narratives repeated so often they've become unquestionable truths. What you're about to see isn't just another political debate where talking heads shout past each other, nor another partisan exercise where tribal loyalty decides the winner before the conversation even begins. This is the moment Megyn Kelly appeared on Real Time with Bill Maher and, methodically, almost surgically, dismantled major progressive narratives about Trump, the economy, immigration, and democracy itself, not with shouting or emotional appeals, but with facts, logic, and calm clarity that makes weak arguments collapse under their own weight. Bill Maher expected a conversation in which Megyn might offer a tepid defense of Trump, perhaps concede most points while quibbling over details. Maybe reluctantly acknowledge that Trump was a unique threat among Republicans. What he got instead was a masterclass in dismantling conventional wisdom built on shaky foundations. Years of crying wolf, weaponizing serious terms for a political gain, and expecting unquestioned acceptance of narratives that crumble under scrutiny. Megyn walked onto the set, fully aware of what Bill and his audience believed, that Trump was a fascist, that the economy was inherited from Obama, that immigration concerns were overblown racism, and that democracy itself was at risk. She could have politely nodded, mildly disagreed, or played the role of a reasonable conservative, mostly agreeing with liberal premises while debating minor details. Instead, she did something far more impactful. She clearly explained why millions of Americans had stopped listening to these arguments, why they no longer took apocalyptic warnings seriously, and why they saw this election as more of the same rhetoric they had heard for decades. This isn't about supporting or opposing Trump, agreeing or disagreeing with Megyn, or judging the legitimacy of Bill's concerns. It's about what happens when someone articulates, with calm precision, why a large portion of the country has stopped taking progressive warnings seriously. Not because they're stupid, evil, or brainwashed, but because they've seen the same playbook applied to every Republican for decades and refuse to pretend this time is different. Bill Maher realized that hosting Megyn Kelly right before an election, giving her the platform to make the case for Trump to his progressive audience, may have been more than he anticipated. She delivered not defensiveness or deflection, but a point-by-point dismantling of narratives that seemed unassailable in progressive echo chambers, but were hollow when examined carefully in front of an audience expecting easy liberal victory. What unfolds in just 5 minutes is more than good television. It's a case study in how widely accepted narratives collapse when someone with knowledge and understanding engages seriously rather than simply accepting the premise of every question. The Real-Time studio carried its familiar energy that night, an audience primed for Bill's mix of comedy and political commentary, expecting the usual dynamic in which Bill's supposed superior reason would guide confused conservatives toward enlightenment. Bill had built his brand as the reasonable liberal, capable of critiquing his own side while emphasizing the threat posed by Republicans. Across from him sat Megyn Kelly, former Fox News anchor, former NBC host, now independent podcaster with one of the most successful shows in political media. She was someone both sides had claimed at various times, someone not easily dismissed as a partisan hack, whose opinions carried weight because she challenged power regardless of party. Bill's generous introduction, praising her intelligence and fairness, was meant to make his critique of her Trump support appear even more devastating. But he miscalculated. He brought on someone who understood the arguments better than he did, studied the data instead of relying on narratives, and was about to show the difference between sounding reasonable and actually being reasonable. The conversation meandered through various topics before reaching the central question. Why would someone as intelligent and reasonable as Megyn Kelly support Donald Trump? Bill had his arguments prepared, rhetorical traps set, audience ready to applaud. I'm not saying you don't have a point. Bill began, setting up what he expected would be a devastating critique. I'm just saying it's hard for people to understand why that which is not democracy. That's the border issue. And you're right. They underscore it up. But with the things Isabel Salin, and all the people in his administration who said he's a fascist. He wants to be a fascist. He talks like a fascist. His friends are all dictators. It was the standard argument repeated thousands of times across progressive media. Trump's associates label him a fascist. Therefore, he is a fascist, and anyone supporting him is complicit in destroying democracy. Megyn had heard it all before, seen it deployed too often, and witnessed its failure to persuade. I don't care about that at all, she said, her voice calm and certain, clearly surprising Bill. Not at all. Bill blinked, momentarily thrown off his rhythm. Wait, why don't you care about that at all? He asked. In response, Megyn delivered what would become the defining moment of the interview. A clear, concise explanation for why millions of Americans had stopped taking apocalyptic warnings about Republican candidates seriously, warnings repeated with identical urgency every election cycle for decades. They've been saying that about Trump for years, Megyn began, her voice patient, as if explaining something obvious. They've said it about Republican candidates for years. It goes way back. If you're even slightly center or center, you're used to seeing your candidate demonized. She was just getting started, building systematically toward a point that would land with devastating force. Whether it's calling someone sexist, racist, or misogynist. They told us Mitt Romney was a raging sexist over binders full of women. They said John McCain was a raging racist, despite adopting a daughter from Bangladesh. Each example added cumulative weight, reminding Bill's audience of times when progressive media had deployed the same apocalyptic rhetoric against Republicans now remembered as reasonable conservatives, against whom Trump was unfavorably compared. They've been doing this for every Republican, Megyn continued. And then they get to Trump, and we just stop listening. Her argument was devastating in its simplicity. You can't cry wolf with every Republican candidate, and then expect people to believe you when you do it again. You can't call Romney a fascist or McCain a racist, then act surprised when your warnings about the next Republican fall flat. Megyn acknowledged that Trump had incendiary rhetoric. She wasn't blindly defending him, but she reminded the audience, we have 4 years to judge him by. And the country was doing pretty well when Trump was in office, unlike the 4 years we've had under these two. Bill tried to redirect toward his prepared arguments about Trump inheriting the economy from Obama. Well, I could argue with that, he said. The stock market is through the roof. Wages are up. Megyn cut through his attempt to reframe. Well, first of all, Trump inherited somebody else's economy. That's what Obama would like us to believe. Bill insisted. Okay, it's really on day one. Everything changed. Megyn's next line exposed the fundamental contradiction in his argument, undermining his economic narrative. So, just walk me through this, she said, her voice patient, leading him to confront the inconsistency. Trump has Obama to thank for his economy, but Biden can't thank Trump for anything. The contradiction hung in the air, and Bill's expression revealed he recognized the trap. If Trump's strong economy was really Obama's, then logically, Biden's early economic struggles should be at least partially credited to Trump. Yet progressives wanted it both ways. Credit Obama for Trump's success, but don't credit Trump for anything positive left for Biden. Bill tried to pivot. Let's get off this, because it's not what I really want to get to. But Megyn wouldn't let him escape an argument he'd started and already lost. Bill, with all due respect, there's probably a reason you don't want to get to it, she said, exposing the hypocrisy with surgical precision. You can't argue that Trump inherited Obama's economy while refusing to acknowledge that Biden inherited anything positive. From Trump, Bill shifted to what he considered his strongest argument. Why would Megyn vote for Trump despite everything he'd done? Look, you want to know why I'm voting for him, notwithstanding what's been said? She husked, her voice carrying the weight of millions of Americans who whose concerns progressive media routinely dismissed as racism or ignorance. I'll give you a couple good reasons off the top of my head. Number 1. What's happened with illegal immigration? I'm voting for him because I don't want any more Laken Rileys. Her voice remained controlled as she referenced the college student murdered by an illegal immigrant. I don't want any more Jocelyn Nungier, the 2-year-old, killed in Houston by 2 Venezuelan illegal immigrants who threw her body over a bridge. Bill attempted the standard progressive response, meant to frame concerns about illegal immigration as unreasonable. Americans have always done that. Megyn was ready. That's not the point. We don't have to take criminals illegally entering from Venezuela. Bill conceded, sensing he couldn't win this argument. Okay, I agree. We took too many immigrants, but we should take in people from other countries to some degree. Yes, Megyn responded. We take in about 1 million legal immigrants every year. Legal? Anytime you take in 1 million people. Some will commit crimes, like any group. Bill thought he had a counter. That crime exists everywhere. So policy shouldn't be judged by tragic cases, that this was emotional reasoning. But Megyn had facts. Do you have any idea how many illegal immigrants we've let in under Biden-Harris? She asked, dropping a statistic that reframed the entire discussion. Bill tried to deflect. Okay, so that's your issue. That's one of them, at least 10.4 million, Megyn continued, refusing to let Bill's attempt at dismissal take hold. That's what Customs and Border Patrol reports. Likely more if you include the ones who got away. Under Trump, it was 2.3 million. The numbers hit hard. This wasn't a marginal difference or a slight variation in policy. This was nearly a 5-fold increase in unmistakable transformation of border enforcement that resulted in millions more illegal entries. Bill tried to pivot, reaching for his usual fallback, that all policy concerns were secondary to democracy itself. But that's more important than democracy, he asked, incredulous. As if posing an unanswerable question, Megyn delivered perhaps the most devastating response of the interview, reframing the entire progressive narrative about threats to democracy. And that is democracy, she said with absolute certainty. What is America if we let another 20 million illegals into your community overrunning towns, endangering citizens, draining resources so community centers close, and basic services become unaffordable? Her point landed with force. For years, progressives had used democracy as a trump card, dismissing policy concerns as irrelevant in the face of Trump's alleged threats. Megyn reframed it. Democracy isn't only about elections or institutional norms. It's about citizens having control over their communities, resources, and safety. When millions enter illegally and local governments cannot provide essential services, democracy itself is under threat. Bill tried to deflect with a joke about Trump's rally rhetoric. It fell flat. This wasn't about clever comebacks or debating tactics. What made this exchange significant was that Megyn clearly articulated why millions of Americans no longer responded to arguments that sounded compelling in progressive echo chambers, but failed to address real consequences. The fascism argument failed because it had been repeated against every Republican for decades. The economy argument failed because progressives applied inconsistent logic. Trump inherited a strong economy, but Biden couldn't inherit any benefits. The immigration argument failed because progressives had no response to the real numbers and the tangible consequences for communities. And the democracy argument, the supposed ultimate Trump card, collapsed because Megyn reframed it entirely. Democracy is citizens' ability to govern their lives and communities, not abstract procedural ideals. Bill Maher deserved credit for giving Megyn a platform to make these points before an election. Yet the conversation revealed why progressives often avoid serious engagement. Arguments that sound persuasive in friendly rooms frequently crumble when confronted by someone who understands the facts and the rhetorical weaknesses in progressive claims. Megyn's broader point was clear. Americans didn't stop listening because they were stupid, evil, or brainwashed. They stopped listening because progressives had repeatedly weaponized terms like fascist or racist, cried apocalypse. Every election, and treated each Republican as uniquely dangerous while holding previous Republicans up as reasonable in hindsight. Mitt Romney was labeled as sexist over binders full of women. John McCain, a war hero and adoptive father, was branded a racist. When serious accusations are used for partisan gain, repeated endlessly, credibility is forfeited. Not with their own tribe, who would always insist the current Republican was worse than all the rest, but with everyone else paying attention and noticing the pattern. Megyn's point about having 4 years to judge. Trump was particularly devastating because it dismantled the "we don't know what he'll do" narrative. We do know what Trump did as president. We have concrete results to evaluate, not apocalyptic predictions that never materialized. For millions of Americans, those results, the economy, foreign policy, lack of new wars compared favorably both to the warnings that never came true and to the outcomes under the current administration. The immigration numbers she cited were equally striking. 10.4 million versus 2.3 million. You could debate what those numbers meant or whether the comparison was entirely fair, but you could not dispute the numbers themselves. The scale of the difference made claims that both administrations had similar approaches absurd on their face. Most importantly, Megyn's reframing of democracy cut to the heart of why progressive arguments often fail to persuade. When people are told their concerns about safety, resources, and community control matter less than protecting democracy. Yet your definition of democracy includes nothing about citizens having meaningful control over the policies that affect their lives. You are not making an argument. You're demanding compliance with your priorities while dismissing theirs. Bill Maher had invited Megyn Kelly onto his show, likely expecting her to concede that even reluctant Trump voters acknowledged the fundamental truth of progressive concerns. Instead, he got a clear, explanation of why those concerns had lost persuasive power for millions of Americans. The fascism charge had been overused to the point of meaninglessness. Economic arguments required logical contortions that became obvious when articulated. Immigration dismissals could not withstand the actual numbers, revealing unprecedented policy changes with real consequences. And the democracy card, meant to trump all other concerns, could itself be reframed to show how progressive policies threaten the meaningful self-governance democracy is supposed to provide. Megyn didn't shout. She didn't resort to personal attacks, conspiracies, or fringe arguments. She simply laid out, calmly and clearly, why millions of Americans had reached conclusions that frustrated progressives who couldn't fathom how anyone could disagree with positions that seemed so obviously correct in echo chambers. This wasn't about whether Megyn was right on every detail. Reasonable people could debate whether Trump posed a threat to democratic norms, or whether immigration numbers told the full story. But they could not credibly claim her position was irrational, uninformed, or purely tribal. That was the real lesson. There were coherent, fact-based, logically consistent arguments for positions that progressive media had long dismissed as obviously wrong. When those arguments were articulated clearly on a major platform to a skeptical audience, they couldn't be easily dismissed. Bill Maher moved on, likely realizing he'd lost the exchange more decisively than anticipated. His audience, used to watching conservatives get dismantled, had instead seen Megyn systematically dismantle Bill's arguments while remaining calm and collected. The conversation highlighted something progressives often ignore. Americans didn't stop listening to warnings about Republicans because they were stupid or evil. They stopped because those warnings were repeated with identical urgency every election cycle, regardless of the actual threat. And, as the fable goes, the boy who cries wolf eventually loses credibility, even when the wolf finally appears. Megyn Kelly left the set having delivered a masterclass in articulating conservative positions to hostile audiences. With facts, historical context, acknowledgement of complexity, and a clear explanation of why arguments that sound compelling in echo chambers often fail to persuade those who've been paying attention for more than one election cycle. Bill Maher, to his credit, provided the platform, but the outcome showed why such engagements are rare. Arguments that seem unassailable to the choir can collapse when someone actually examines them.